Welcome, everyone. I'm Bonnie Glazer. I am Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and thanks so much for joining us today to talk about the 50th anniversary of the UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, which was passed 50 years ago. October 25th actually marks the 50th anniversary of the passage of the resolution. And the resolution recognized that the People's Republic of China is the only legitimate representative of China to the United Nations. That took place in 1971. But moreover, the resolution expelled the representatives in the language of the resolution, the representatives of the Chiang Kai-shek regime from the United Nations. That was an indirect reference to the Republic of China, located then on the island of Taiwan. However, the resolution was silent on the potential participation of the Republic of China or Taiwan in the United Nations or UN agencies. Beijing has used UN Resolution 2758 along with other means to prevent Taiwan from having a voice and a role in the international system. Just last month, for example, the PRC Foreign Ministry spokesman said, and I quote, "The Taiwan region's participation in international organization must be handled in accordance with the One China principle, which is an important principle established by UNGA Resolution 2758, end quote. Now, Beijing's One China principle asserts that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. But that position is not accepted by all UN member states. Last year, a Chinese official went so far as to describe US support for Taiwan's participation in the UN as a serious violation of Resolution 2758. This is obviously a deliberate distortion of the resolution and should be challenged by countries around the world who support Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN and its agencies. In 2007, when then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon cited UN Resolution 2758 as indicating that Taiwan is part of China, the United States objected and reportedly issued a 9-point démarche to the UN. That leaked document was included in a report by John Kasich that was published by the Heritage Foundation in 2008. And other countries, including Australia, Canada, Japan, and New Zealand, expressed concern at the time about Secretary General Ban's statement. The United States has long held the position that Taiwan's sovereignty was left unsettled in the post-World War II San Francisco Peace Treaty. The U.S. acknowledges but does not accept the PRC's position that Taiwan is part of China. Resolution 2758 decided the issue of China's representation in the United Nations, but the matter of Taiwan's participation in the UN remains unresolved. And in today's conversations, we hope to provide greater clarity on UN Resolution 2758 and to discuss how to enhance Taiwan's meaningful participation within the UN system. Before I introduce our speakers, I will just quickly note if you do have a question and you'd like to send it in, I'm going to give you the email of my program assistant because since we are doing this live on WebEx, we don't have a chat bar that can be used. But I do hope if you have questions, you will send them. You can send them to M. Ladner, M as in Mary, Ladner, at gmfus.org. So now I'm going to introduce our really terrific speakers today, and I'm really delighted to have all of them. We have Rick Waters, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for China, Mongolia, and China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And we have Ms. Wang Liangyu, who is the Deputy Representative of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, or TECRO, in the United States. She was previously Taiwan's representative in Geneva. And we have Dr. Otmar Kloiber, who is the Secretary General of the World Medical Association. And that's a global organization representing the voice of physicians, and it has an official relationship with the World Health Organization. So, with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Deputy Assistant Secretary Waters for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. It's good to see you all. And Representative Wong, it's a pleasure to have a real expert on these issues at our discussion today. Dr. Kloiber, good to see you as well. Bonnie, if I could, I'd like to just take a few minutes to talk a little bit about how we see this important anniversary next Monday in the context of our overall view of Taiwan's role in the UN system. 50 years ago, when Taiwan, in the 50 years since Taiwan emerged from martial law to become one of the world's most vibrant democracies, it's been quite heartening to see Taiwan emerge at the center of a global tech economy as a hub of travel, culture, and education. I think we are not alone among UN member states in viewing Taiwan as a valued partner and a force for good around the world in many of these areas. Which is why, for the United States, Taiwan being blocked from participation in nearly all of the UN activities creates an immense cost, not just to Taiwan, but I think to UN members as well. I mean, if we consider just a couple of examples, you have 50 million passengers traveling annually through Taiwan's airports, and yet Taiwan is not in the International Civil Aviation Organization's triennial assembly. Um, in the midst of a pandemic, where Taiwan's public health response has been one of the world's best, we don't see Taiwan in the World Health Assembly helping to shape our global pandemic response. I mean, there are many more examples: Taiwan students, artists, journalists, human rights advocates, and others being blocked from UN activities or from entering UN facilities. The question becomes why this is occurring, and to us, the reason is that the People's Republic of China has misused Resolution 2758 to prevent Taiwan's meaningful participation. And in doing so, I think our view is that Beijing is denying the international community the ability to gain from the valuable contributions that Taiwan offers. We also see a pattern of Beijing seeking to modulate the scope of Taiwan's engagements according to cross-strait political dynamics. The door will open a bit when Taiwan's leaders are viewed favorably, and maybe it closes again when the PRC sends a signal of disapproval. It doesn't seem to us that this in any way advances um, peace in the cross-strait context. It's not, as I said, just Taiwan and its 24 million people that suffer. We've seen the PRC use its seat on the UN NGO committee to block the accreditation of any group that doesn't refer to Taiwan in the way that Beijing favors. And I wanted to highlight one, particularly egregious example that happened earlier this year when the UN withheld permission for an American high school in Colorado to attend the UN Commission on the Status of Women until it pulled down a posting that had been put on the school's website a previous year. I mean, this really, I think, starkly illustrates the point of the misuse of 2758. Our own view is that we should be supporting a more inclusive approach, and it would allow the international community and the UN to benefit from this expertise. We have been actively encouraging member states, civil society, and individuals who care about the problem to join us in supporting Taiwan's robust, meaningful participation throughout the UN system and the international community. And indeed, this is referenced in the Taiwan Relations Act, which, as we know, is one of the foundational documents of our One China policy. The world, in our view, needs Taiwan's expertise for everything from advancing standards to charting a course in key technological realms. And I want to just highlight two specific areas where we think over the past year, this has been particularly problematic. One I mentioned a little bit earlier, the global COVID response. Taiwan's response to the global pandemic was clearly one of the world's best. I think we've all been following closely the tools that were used in Taiwan's context, and with admiration, Taiwan's ability to thread the needle between the competing imperatives of protecting public health, individual rights, and livelihood. And it's noteworthy that Taiwan's economy was the fastest growing in Asia in 2020, which I think is a true testament to the balance that was struck. And yet, despite all of this, Taiwan is not part of the WHO conversation. I have a very personal view of this because I remember when President Tsai in March of last year first announced that Taiwan was going to be a world leader in contributing to the pandemic response of others. And, soon after that, more than 50 million life-saving masks worldwide were distributed by Taiwan authorities. I still have mine here. It's getting a little bit old, but it was an incredible token of appreciation from all of us when we saw that gesture at a point in time when personal protective equipment was very hard to come by. The other example I wanted to highlight is Interpol. And the absence of a mechanism to allow non-member access to Interpol's databases hampers Taiwan's ability to share and receive critical public safety information. A good example, Taiwan is unable to see criminal information for inbound travelers, which presents security risks not just to Taiwan, but to others. The same is true in reverse. Taiwan is unable to share its own information easily, making it difficult for us to participate in efforts to capture Taiwanese criminals who flee abroad. There was a very uh, poignant example of this problem recently, where a man in Taiwan killed his mother and father-in-law, abducted a one-year-old child, and fled overseas. Taiwan sought help from Interpol members to circulate information, but was unsuccessful in doing so. And so we view these practical hurdles as endangering the safety of all UN members, not just those on Taiwan. So I want to just close off by saying that, as I said at the beginning, the exclusion of Taiwan undermines important work for all of us, and we've seen in Secretary Gutierrez's common agenda his own call, his own challenge to the UN members, um, that our challenges globally are interconnected across borders and across divides. They can only be met by truly interconnected responses. We actually see that fulfilling this vision requires UN member states to join us in supporting Taiwan's robust and meaningful participation through the UN system and the international community. So, Bonnie, I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing from others and also to the questions.
Thank you so much, Das Waters. We'll now give the floor to Deputy Representative Wang Liangyu.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, for organizing today's event. And thank you, Des Waters, for your encouraging remarks. And I really appreciate this opportunity to discuss Taiwan's international participations with you all. I think today's discussion is a long overdue acknowledgement of a serious gap in international collaboration. Although today's topic is regarding the implications of UN Resolution 2758 on Taiwan, I would first like to echo Des Waters and emphasize that this resolution, or more specifically, the intentional misinterpretation of the resolution, I think it's actually a perfect textbook example of how China uses its influence to exert its will over the UN system. It not only affects Taiwan, but also has a much deeper and profound impact on the effectiveness of the multilateral system. Let me also give you an example. Just 2 weeks ago, WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, held its 62nd assembly in Geneva. One of the agenda items was the admission of observers, and the Wikimedia Foundation was one of the candidates. Despite the support from the United States and the group of industrialized countries at WIPO, the application was eventually blocked by China. And the same thing actually happened at last year's assembly as well. In this meeting, the Chinese delegation claimed that the affiliated websites of Wikimedia contain a large amount of misinformation that run counter to the One China principle and UN Resolution 2758. They further stated that WIPO, being a UN specialized agency, should observe Resolution 2758 as well as its long-standing position on Taiwan, by which they mean China's One China principle. If you find this case surprising, I'm sorry to tell you that this is not by any means an isolated incident. Similar episodes happened year after year in New York when NGOs apply for consultative status with the UN, and I think Des Waters also mentioned about that. And in recent years, we have noticed that the situation is also getting worse in Geneva when NGOs applying to similar consultative relations with WHO. And because these UN specialized agencies generally run by consensus, so any one country can veto accreditation process. If NGOs cannot pass China's censorship, its application will be blocked. In their statement to WIPO, China was trying to achieve two actions at once. That is, abuse the consensus-based decision-making process to dictate who can and cannot have access to UN discussions and resources, while fabricating a legal basis from Resolution 2758 to insert its own claim into the UN system and beyond. In view of this, I think the question countries need to ask themselves is whether you want to allow China to dictate your policy for you in the UN system. So what is this Resolution 2758 really about? As Fanny pointed out in the opening, the resolution only addresses the issue of China's representation in the United Nations. It does not mention Taiwan or the issue of Taiwan's representation in the UN system. At best, the Resolution 2758 merely decided upon the question of credentials. That is, the question of who represents the UN member state China without implying a position on the scope of its territory, let alone endorsing the PRC's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. But over the years, China has made the leap from a matter of accreditation to a political statement, even a legal claim. Therefore, nowadays, the resolution is often wrongly cited to exclude Taiwan's participation in the meetings and activities in the UN system. And I think as the international community can clearly see, the fact and the reality is that the PRC has never governed Taiwan. And based on the principles of effective authority and democratic legitimacy, only Taiwan's democratically elected government can represent its 23.5 million people in the UN system. Now also please allow me to turn to Taiwan's situation in the UN system. I think in recent years, we have seen autocracy gain even more ground in international organizations, and the space for Taiwan's participation is being further squeezed because of political interference. One example is that the UN has gone beyond the scope of safety and security protocols and gradually tailored its requirements regarding acceptable IDs to suit certain countries' political agendas. Several years ago, the UN imposed a new policy requesting all visitors to present an ID issued by either member states or observer states. And the new requirement has been deliberately used to prevent any Taiwanese participants or even tourists from entering UN venues, including the headquarters in New York. And this is happening in spite of the fact that this policy directly contradicts to the UN Legal Office's previous opinion, which states that the validity of a passport depends on whether it is accepted as valid by other countries. And I don't need to point out that nearly all UN member states accept Taiwanese passports as valid photo ID for entering into their territories. And more than 140 countries actually grant visa-free status for Taiwanese passport holders. And during my 2.5 years in Geneva, I saw our experts be denied registration for the technical meetings that they used to be able to attend. And I saw our students registered to open to public event just to be stopped at the security gate upon arrival, just because they hold Taiwanese passport. And I also witnessed the representatives from our NGOs, their badges were revoked because the Chinese spotted that there were Taiwanese nationals in the meetings. And all this happened when leaders of the UN system were talking about solidarity and inclusiveness. We very much appreciate that the United States, the European Union, and other like-minded countries have long supported Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system. But when our experts, our NGOs, private sector, and even young students and journalists are totally blocked from UN activities and venues, we are far away from meaningful participation. Therefore, I think that one of the most pressing tasks is to put an end to the UN's discriminatory policy against Taiwanese passport holders. And I should say it's not all bad news when it comes to Taiwan's international participation. On a more positive note, we very much appreciate that with the support from the United States and like-minded countries, this year's G7 Foreign Ministers meeting expressed support for Taiwan's meaningful participation in WHO and WHA for the first time. I think Taiwan has demonstrated its ability and willingness to work with the international community in tackling cross-border issues. We will continue to work with like-minded countries to advance our meaningful participation and make concrete contributions on the international stage. And we believe including Taiwan in related discussions and activities is only fair and is in line with the inclusive principle of multilateralism. To conclude, I would like to restate that Resolution 2758 only addresses the question of Chinese representation. To strengthen global cooperation on issues concerns to us all, we cannot afford to treat solidarity and inclusiveness as mere slogans. We must instead ensure inclusive process in international organizations. And the international community should not be denied the experience and contributions that the world's 22nd largest economy and its 23.5 million people have to offer. And finally, and most importantly, we cannot have democratic systems at home, yet authoritarian system in international organizations. Democracies must safeguard their values in international organizations as well. And I think I will just stop here and I look forward for further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Wang, for your remarks. Both you and Das Waters referred to the role of NGOs, and so I'm really pleased that we have Dr. Kloiber to join us today to talk about the World Medical Association's relationship with Taiwan, with its NGOs, and about some of the pressure that it has faced from Beijing. So I turn the floor over to you, Dr. Kloiber.
Thank you, Mrs. Glaser, and thank you for inviting us to this dialogue here. Perhaps I may take a few minutes to speak about the World Medical Association to understand our DNA in this whole process and why we are reacting on this and why we are keen to be involved. The World Medical Association is a relatively new organization founded in 47, immediately after World War II. And it was a reaction to the abuse of medicine that happened, especially in my country, Germany, at that time during the Third Reich. So at that time, the community, and it was actually a world community of physicians which met in London and later in Paris, decided to have a fresh start with a new association that specifically looked at the questions of medical deontology or medical ethics. How should doctors behave? What should they do? How should their associations behave in this world? And actually, at that time, there were a lot of medical associations already from Eastern Europe, including also and Asia, including the Chinese Medical Association, which were a founding member of the World Medical Association in 1947. Years later, most of the medical associations which were in then communist countries had to leave the World Medical Association or were dissolved in their countries. And the World Medical Association for a long time, until the 1990s, was a more Western NGO with membership mainly from the free world. And we clearly have it in our principles that we really appraise democratic procedures, democratic participation, even in our member societies. That is one of the requirements which we have, that really all can participate fairly and equally in our organization. But of course, the organization is also representing now 115 national and territorial medical associations towards the international organizations, especially the UN organizations, but also others. And within those organizations, of course, the World Health Organization for us as a medical organization is the most important one. Now, about 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more, we started to campaign for a meaningful participation of Taiwan in the World Health Organization. It was actually a movement that started in several of the member organizations of the World Medical Association. I myself at that time was working with the German Medical Association, not with the WMA. And we started a campaign in Germany in order to have Taiwan participating in the World Health Organization. This became mainstream in the organization and had a very strong support. And the World Medical Association adopted this position that Taiwan should be part of the actions of the World Health Organization, should be participating as well actively as also receiving assistance from the World Health Organization. There was an event that was strikingly sad in that development in 2003 when we had the SARS epidemic, when Taiwan was one of the countries that was hit very hard by the SARS epidemic. And it took an awful long time that experts from WHO could come to Taiwan because of this difficult relationship and of the intervention, quite obviously, of Beijing, which did not facilitate this, which really made it very, very difficult to have action in Taiwan included. So this to a large extent spurred our activity. It spurred also the activity in the World Medical Association, which then I became Secretary General of in 2005, which was also the year when we then passed the first resolution to have Taiwan participating as an observer in the World Health Organization. Why did we do this? Now, of course, we are not a political organization. We deal, of course, with health policy, we deal with social policy, no question about that, but we're not a political organization. We are not an organization which determines what is a state and what is a country and what is not. We respect the United Nations, we respect the decisions of our member countries, of our governments, that is very clear. On the other hand, we have a World Health Organization which has in its own constitution a sentence which says that we want to attain by all peoples the highest possible level of health. And that cannot mean that there is a large group of people in Taiwan being excluded from that and being there at the grace of a government in Beijing waiting that the help can arrive or that they themselves can participate as they wish to do. And let me say, Taiwan has developed extremely well in the healthcare sector during the past 30, 40 years, developing a very strong health insurance system, which is one of the most modern and capable systems in the world, certainly. A system that is very close to what we think is universal health coverage and offering this to their people. It has been technologically at the forefront, and it has also been extremely helpful on the humanitarian field, sending help to countries in emergency situations, to catastrophes, with a large amount of expertise and willingness to help. And also in our organization, although Taiwan is not one of our biggest members, it is a very strong participator and strong supporter of our actions, and always present and willing to help. So this support, which has been growing over time in the early 2000s, has maintained, and it then didn't become that much more an issue when in 2006 Taiwan was for the first time then allowed to send an observer delegation to the World Health Assembly, which we thought was the right step forward, was a very good sign for including our colleagues, the health system of Taiwan, and the health of Taiwan as such, into the work of the World Health Organization, participating as an observer, but also participating in technical meetings, which are really important for the development of medicine in any nations. And we think that all groups and all parts of this world should be able to be represented there and be able to participate actively. Now, unfortunately, we experienced that in 2017, I think it was the first time that we experienced that. This openness ended. And again, our colleagues from Taiwan could not participate in the World Health Assembly as observers, and the cooperation came to an end. We had discussions within our organization, and finally, this year, we reaffirmed our position very strongly. And we have just last week in our General Assembly reaffirmed our resolution supporting Taiwan and asking for a meaningful participation in the World Health Organization as an observer, but also to have Taiwan participating in, for instance, the international health regulations, which regulate the cooperation of nations in the time of a pandemic. And we believe that Taiwan should not be excluded from that, but should be included. And quite correctly, Mr. Waters has given the example of Taiwan as being one of the countries that has done very well during the pandemic and could be very much being a leading example on how to deal with the pandemic and pandemics in the past. So we think it is still, there is still the need that there is a meaningful participation of Taiwan to the World Health Organization. We cannot speak for other parts of the United Nations as we are really a medical organization and that is our focus. But I believe the challenge will be the same for other areas of economy, of science, of our living together in this world. So we have affirmed that. I can tell you that, of course, there were fierce discussions with our Chinese colleagues, which is a strong member in our World Medical Association that we have experienced. But in the end, there was a very, very clear majority in favor of this resolution. So our position towards the participation of Taiwan has not changed. Back to you, Ms. Glaser.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kloiber. Really appreciate all of that history of what your organization has experienced in dealing with Taiwan and your argument in favor of having Taiwan be a more active participant. And I also want to underscore how important it is for Taiwan in the medical sphere to play an important role. It is really such a leader in combating COVID-19. Has been so much more effective than so many other countries around the world. So let me start, Das Waters, by asking you about the State Department's reaction, the government's response overall to Chinese pressure on NGOs. And you mentioned that really excellent example of the high school in Colorado. And we had a question come in from Tina Chung, who works at the Voice of America, who noted that the former deputy ambassador at the UN, Kelly Curry, said that the U.S. hasn't done enough to push back on China's influence. So what is the U.S. doing specifically in the area of NGOs, where, as you mentioned, the PRC is trying to put pressure on these NGOs to change how they reference Taiwan on their websites, so that they say Taiwan, comma, province of China, or something like that, or they just won't allow groups like high school students to visit the United Nations?
Thanks, Bonnie. And by the way, before I respond, I just want to thank all of our speakers today. I thought the presentations were superb, and I've learned a lot myself. On the specific issue of NGOs, I would highlight four areas that the U.S. government is involved in uh, advocating for our position on Taiwan's participation. One is in our public messaging. I mean, we've consistently highlighted the value of Taiwan's meaningful participation in UN activities, particularly in the areas of public health and safety, as you know. This would include the World Health Assembly, ICAO, Interpol. And we've been trying to make the argument, which is not a hard one to make, that it's in the best interest of UN member states themselves for Taiwan to be involved in our response to transnational challenges. But beyond the public messaging, we do have fairly robust private engagements on the issue with UN leaders in New York, Geneva, Montreal, and elsewhere. Um, I want to highlight, though, a third element of our advocacy, which is through like-minded partners. We're seeing increasing interest among other countries in the issue of Taiwan's exclusion. And I appreciated what Representative Wong said about the G7 foreign ministerial statement. I was involved in my previous role in negotiating that statement, and it was not a very difficult sell to get language in on the importance of Taiwan in the UN system. But one final piece that I did want to highlight, I know you're very familiar with it, Bonnie, is the Global Cooperative Training Framework, CTF, which essentially organizes virtual workshops to show and share Taiwan's expertise, often on the margins of UN and UN agency events. So we think GCTF is also a useful mechanism, but in a way, its very existence underlies the problem that really what we should be aiming for is meaningful participation in the events, not just on the sidelines.
Great, thank you so much. Deputy Representative Wong, let's like you to talk a little bit about how Beijing is actually using its position and influence in the UN to promote this stance that Taiwan is part of China. What are the ways that you see that taking place, and have those efforts been increasing dramatically in recent years?
Thank you, Bonnie. I think I will just answer from my observation from Geneva. I think China is taking various approaches to exert its influence. From legal perspective, as we mentioned, the intentionally misinterpretation of the resolution. And since in recent years that Chinese nationals are heading in some of the specialized organization, and even though in the organizations that they may not serve as the head of the organization, normally Chinese nationals will be within the small leadership group. And they have been using these kinds of position to insert their narratives or definitions into the UN documents. And for example, I think since 2007, Chinese nationals started to serve as the undersecretary for the economic and social affairs. And since 2008, we start to see this kind of fabricated interpretation regarding Resolution 2758 sneaking into the documents or the legal opinions of UN. And we also learned that recently, even now, China is still trying to use their leadership position to change the nomenclature of Taiwan in UN publications and also in the publications related to NGOs that wants to have working relationship with UN. And another way to insert their legal claim is to sign a memorandum with international organizations. I think that this is just similar to what they are doing to sign memorandums on One Belt One Road or inject the Xi thoughts into the UN documents. And I think the most well-known memorandum regarding Taiwan's participation is the secret memorandum signed in 2005 between China and the WHO. And ever since that has set very strict restrictions on Taiwan's access to even technical activities of WHO. And until today, it's still a serious issue for us. And recent discussions has been focused on, for example, their leadership position. But I think another trend is worth to notice is in recent years, they also systematically to support more junior officials in the UN. They sponsored the JPO, that's a junior personnel program. And for that kind of position, that they can actually watch the day-by-day operations of UN. And when I was in Geneva, I was told by an official from Security Department, because I was asking about our passports access issue. And he told me that even though like-minded countries do raise the issue to the Secretariat from time to time, but Chinese nationals, they are checking the list of participants to activities on a daily basis. And whenever they spot a name with Taiwanese origin, they would check the background. And I also sense a sense of worry about job security for UN officials, even if they are not Chinese nationals. So I think these are the areas that's really worthwhile for further exploring for member states when we are talking about the reform of UN system. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kloiber, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether when Taiwan actually was an observer in the WHO, whether that solved the problems. If we were able to return Taiwan as an observer to the World Health Assembly, would that ultimately solve all the problems? Would you be able to interact with Taiwan in all the ways, and would Taiwan be able to interact with NGOs and with the UN in very effective ways? Or is even when Taiwan was an observer, as I recall, there were still problems. So I'm curious if you can address that.
Yeah, thank you. Two perspectives on that. One is our perspective. One is, of course, the perspective of Taiwan then as a participant there. and I'm only able to answer for our side. I can tell you that it has eased certainly our relationship with WHO quite a bit during that time. It was certainly less tensions because before that and after that, we always had to bring up the issue of Taiwan and its participation to the WHO. Um, and in WHO, and maybe that is for many people, it's not that clear and not that well known. WHO acts also as a technical agency, and it brings together a lot of medical expertise on a daily basis in an exchange that is crucial for the development and the running of healthcare systems and medicine. And that is for any technical aspect, whether that is grading of tumors and staging of tumors, or that is running a healthcare system and health economics. So there is a lot of exchange, participation, and work. And yes, of course, it was extremely helpful to see that Taiwanese colleagues were then able to participate at least more than what it was before. I'm not sure whether it was really complete and very really inclusive to all and everything. I think there still were a lot of hurdles there which could have been brought down. But yes, that was certainly a time for us that solved a number of problems. Um, Personally speaking, I think that is a minimum step into inclusion. I think there is more that can be done and more participation that can be offered. I cannot answer this question, of course, from the perspective of Taiwan, um, but I assume also Taiwan has felt this as a help to be able to observe and to be able to be part of the technical meetings. Back to you.
Let me follow up by asking you, Dr. Kloiber, whether your organization's advocacy for Taiwan's meaningful participation in the World Health Organization has led to any backlash within the UN system.
The backlash was already there before. I mean, it was when in 2017 we certainly found that our observer delegation was at least in part hindered to go to the World Health Assembly. I'm not speaking about an observer delegation for Taiwan, but we as an NGO have the right to send in observers to the World Health Assembly as well. And of course, our observers are coming from different countries. They come from Europe, the Americas, Asia, Africa, and they are a volunteer team which then goes into the World Health Assembly for us to observe, sometimes also to make statements on behalf of the WMA. And of course, there may be also colleagues coming from Taiwan. And in 2017, I got a call in the morning at the beginning of the World Health Assembly, and my Taiwanese colleague told me and said, well, not only that they don't let me in, they have taken my badge away because I presented my passport. And yes, so there have been backlashes. There are these constant demands by the Chinese Medical Association, but also by WHO to change the name of the Taiwan Medical Association. And of course, my answer can only be, I'm sorry, this island is called Taiwan. And as long as one of our members doesn't come with a completely ridiculous name, I cannot ask them to change their names. That is up for each medical association. So the way they want to be called, and as long as that is realistic, there is nothing that I can or should do with that. And I also reminded my colleague, the Secretary General of the Chinese Medical Association, who is constantly asking me or telling me that the Taiwan Medical Association has a wrong name, and that it cannot be called Taiwan. I told him that when I arrived at the airport in Beijing, I saw a line on the airport in Beijing which was called Passports from Taiwan. So is there a little bit of hypocrisy in there and a game that is being played with us? But as I said, we cannot and will not change the name of a member association, at least not as long as it is not completely ridiculous. And that is a position which we maintained. And I, of course, always consulted with my board and my council, and they affirmed that's the name, that's what we use, and we are not going to do anything different in there.
I'd like to pose a question both to Representative Wang and to Das Waters. I often speak to experts from China who insist that Taiwan's participation in the UN is really intended to promote Taiwan independence. Obviously, we know that the People's Republic of China strongly opposes the independence, potential de jure legal independence of Taiwan. So, what can Taiwan and perhaps the US do to reassure Beijing that, in fact, Taiwan's participation in UN agencies is not intended to advance Taiwan's independence? Representative Wang? I think we have just lost Representative Wang.
It's a very auspicious orange triangle up there.
I don't know what that triangle means, but I hope that we're going to get her back. So, Das Waters, I think you'll have to go first.
All right. Well, I hope that wasn't a subtle message in some way, somehow. Bonnie, I think the point you raise is a very important one. And earlier in the discussion, you mentioned the foreign ministry's recent comments in Beijing on a related point. I think it's important to talk about this honestly. I mean, as you can imagine, there are
Can you hear
men.
me?
Oh,
Uh,
I think we have you back.
we have you back. We're going to let Das Waters answer the question first, and then we'll
Sure.
come to you. But we're
Sure.
thrilled that you are back.
I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No worries. Okay, Das Waters, please continue.
Bonnie, I think I'll be brief, but I think, as you can imagine, there are many things every day in the foreign ministry briefing with which we would disagree, and I think those who are listening in on this line are very familiar with the U.S. One China policy, what the PRC calls its One China principle, and the differences therein. But I think in the UN context, like what I would say is that we simply don't agree that the participation of Taiwan civil society journalists, students, or others in any way kind of prejudices the question you reference. We simply see that as a logical uh, activity that is worthy of our support. And I think that Representative Wong hit on two other key issues that again are not directly related to the point you raised, but that I did want to emphasize. The issue of Taiwan's participation is really fundamental to supporting the rules-based international order, and it is coming under pressure from the People's Republic of China in many ways, some of which are not even linked to Taiwan. Our concerns are far broader. They include how the PRC is using its nationals in the UN system as professional staff and elected leaders to advance national agendas and not their own. So, I would say in sum that I think in a way the premise of that accusation is something that we would fundamentally disagree with.
Representative Wang?
Yes. Thank you, Bonnie, for this question. And I think there is differences between the approach towards multilateralism between democratic countries and authoritarian countries. If you listen to the recent remarks made by Chinese, they would insist on a state-centric approach. And I think for democratic countries, they would like to see a multi-stakeholders approach. And by insisting a state-centric approach, I think for China, they would like to dictate who can have the access to the discussion in the UN. And they have intentionally to portray Taiwan's international participation as a political issue. But for example, next month, there will be three major events happening. That is the COP26 and Interpol, and also a special session for the WHA. If you take a look at the agenda of these UN-related meetings, those are all technical meetings and discuss professional issues. And that's the area where Taiwan do have the expertise to contribute. And I think Dr. Kloiber also mentioned earlier, those international organizations, they are not only run by the assembly once a year, they are dealing with day by day issues. And for example, WHO and also Interpol, they both manage a range of database. And countries need to have up-to-date, timely information to be able to coordinate on issues related to global health security and also tackling cross-border crimes and criminals. So I think we need to make it clear that Taiwan's participation is related to the function of the successful multilateral cooperation, and it's really based on the need and the necessity of the effectiveness of multilateral cooperation. Thank you.
Well, this has really been an outstanding discussion. I want to thank all three of you for coming today and giving really thoughtful and informative presentations about the challenges that are posed by the misuse and distortion of UN Resolution 2758. Even as we mark this 50th anniversary of this resolution being passed, as has been made clear throughout this discussion, that the resolution itself simply addressed the issue of who represents China at the UN in the international system of the UN, and that is certainly the People's Republic of China. But the participation of Taiwan, of its citizens, of its experts, its NGOs, and its government officials is critically important. It is important not just, as Das Waters told us, for the people of Taiwan, but also for people globally and governments all around the world to be able to benefit from Taiwan's expertise. So I want to thank Deputy Assistant Secretary Waters, Deputy Representative Wang Liangyu from TECRO, and Dr. Otmar Kloiber, Secretary General of the World Medical Association. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you,
Thank
Bonnie.
you.
Bonnie, thank you.